This talk has been put together to allow people to access the content of the Foundation Phase seminars online. If you've already looked at part 1, you'll know that these seminars have been run in the Bristol service for some years, and that we've had patient volunteers contribute to the material. And each session that we run, we have a group of people living with the condition who will be contributing and developing the understanding of managing the condition as we go. This section is really just focusing in particular on a very problematic element of the condition, which is what's called post-exertional malaise. Malaise comes from the French. It describes very simply feeling ill, and it's very important that that's recognised, that the fatigue and the other symptoms that come with ME/CFS are much more akin to feeling ill than just ordinary tiredness or even ordinary fatigue. Post-exertional malaise is that consequence of having an extra level of activity, but it's that delayed onset of symptoms, and we'll be exploring this as we go. In the seminars we start really by exploring what might happen with people on a somewhat better day. So thinking about a better day, we'll ask people who come into the group what sort of things they might tend to do on one of those days, and of course it may not be so obvious first thing that it's a better day. Most people wake up feeling really as if they haven't got any benefit from their sleep, but gradually there's a sense that this day might be a bit more like it. Not a great day, but something a bit more possibly doable on a day like this. And people describe a list of things that they might do. They might do shopping, they might do some work or more study, housework, might take the chance to see people, socialise, make some of those difficult phone calls that are otherwise a lot more challenging, maybe get out and do some gardening or take some exercise. So these are very individual things that people report they'll do more of. But in short, what people are doing is taking a chance on a better day to do more. And then we'll ask the group, really, why is it that more happens on a better day? And there's a list of reasons for that really, but it's really important just to get some clarity and understanding about what's going on here. And in terms of those factors, there's a whole list of reasons for doing more. People can do more, they need to do more, there's things that have to happen. It allows them to connect with people, and if they've been isolated, this is an important aspect. There may be a sense of achievement of being able to maybe complete something on a better day. Maybe feeling a bit more normal for a while. Some people as well identify possibly an element of guilt if they've been relying on others to help them out with things. Maybe this is a day that they could pay it back a bit. It's also a chance to sort of catch up on jobs that haven't been happening, a sort of window of opportunity to catch up. Other people identify a sort of maybe a pressure from within themselves to push on, and sometimes pressure from others to push on as well. So there's a whole list of reasons, and you may well identify your own personal reasons for doing more on one of those somewhat better days. And it's just important to get transparency about these reasons, just to understand clearly why it is that people do it, and it makes complete sense. But I guess one of the things that we're exploring here is post-exertional malaise, and the fact that many people, having done more on one of these better days, may well experience what's called payback, which is an increase in symptoms that may not happen on the day. It may be a day later, it may be 2 days later, and for different individuals in the groups that we run, the delay does differ, and I think at different phases in the condition the extent of the delay differs as well. But most people will experience this payback. And that has a consequence. It's an increase in symptoms, but it can also be a consequence in terms of morale for some people as well. If they've had to deal with a spell of increased symptoms, it's not an easy process. And the consequence for many people is it slows them down. It makes it difficult to get on and to do things. And then the jobs pile up, and then they start to feel more out of control of life as well because of this. But gradually, after a period of slowdown, it is possible over time then to have a period when things start to feel better. But then there's a potential to end up in a cycle, a vicious cycle, which is sometimes called the boom and bust cycle, because it can just carry on going round and round in that boom and bust pattern. So this is something that most people coming to our seminars will recognise from their own experience before they come. And at this stage we're really just drawing on people's experience to understand the process, the reasons behind it, but also identifying that this is one of the reasons that this condition is so challenging, is that the delayed reaction doesn't always give people warning. Looking at this cycle here, I can kind of spot what seems to be a more positive half of it. The better day, the doing more, looks positive on the face of it. But then if we ask people in the group about the other half of the cycle, the slowing down, the payback, generally they will report that that lasts longer. So we have a kind of pattern of one step forward and two steps back. If we were to draw that out on a graph long ways, you'd see an increase in activity which isn't sustainable, and then a longer recovery phase. And every time I see this graph of the increase and then the decrease, it just reminds me of this roller coaster. And for some people it might well feel like that as well. If they're on the boom and bust roller coaster, there's that feeling of being somewhat out of control of it. That the recovery phase means that they're losing contact with people, their jobs are piling up, and then when the opportunity comes to do more, they'll take that opportunity, but then it drives the process again. And it's this longer recovery phase that's particularly challenging and difficult to work with. So we asked people in the group, how do they self-manage this? What do they do? What have they already learned? And one of the good things about working in a group like this is that people have all sorts of good strategies they can share. A common one is pacing, which is breaking things into chunks in a deliberate way, not carrying on until people need to stop, but a definite sense of people saying, look, I'll do this and then I'll stop, because if I stop at the right point, I'll be able to manage another chunk of activity later. And they'll be planning their time like that. And with that, a sense of prioritising, about choosing what's important for today, and a willingness to actually just put some things off because they're less important on that day. Often with that, what is a challenging step for many people of asking for help or delegating, and also using planned rest, using a deliberate strategy of blocking out rest periods to help to sustain activity over a longer period in a more gradual way. But many people will recognise in our seminars that all of these strategies are underpinned by a level of acceptance of the condition, and that it's actually very difficult to take on board these strategies if people are perhaps still not kind of ready to accept that they're dealing with this condition. And the aim of all these strategies really in terms of self-management is to try and keep activity more on an even keel. So rather than the roller coaster of activity, when people can, using these approaches, they're more on an even keel, got that sustainable baseline level that is more similar day after day. And for some people, they'll recognise that when they're more on an even keel, they're achieving a little bit more regularly, and at the end of a week, at the end of a fortnight, at the end of a month, they may well have achieved more by holding things back a little bit than they'll achieve if they're always pushing to achieve the maximum every day, but then pushing into a boom and bust cycle. So this is challenging. If I ask people in a group, what's it like to hold back? The general consensus is it's actually really hard to hold back when people want to be doing more on a day that feels a bit better, a bit easier. But yet there's a sense that if people do try and manage things differently, there's more of a sustainable pattern of activity. And this session is really focusing on that. And whilst we recognise there's other factors that have an impact on that, such as sleep, stress levels, all sorts of factors will impact on this. At the moment we're just really focusing in on activity levels to get some clarity on this. And we'll be working with a group to help them develop a skill which is known as activity analysis. And we see this very much as a self-management skill. And there's some ideas here of breaking down different types of activity, separating out sleep from rest, seeing those as different activities, seeing rest as being different from a low demand activity, low and medium demand activities separately, and identifying clearly what's high demand, what drains the batteries quickly. And we've used colour coding here because these colours can be helpful for keeping a diary, which I'll show in a moment. But just for the time being on this slide, just thinking about the things in your own life which are high demand. And this will differ for different people. The groups we run are outpatient groups, so these are people who are well enough to get to the department, and they'll often report activities like driving, standing up, childcare, walking, doing more cognitively taxing activities, brain tasks, as being high demand activities. And when we ask about low demand activities, people will tend to be thinking about watching television, listening to the radio, having a quiet conversation. But importantly, they'll be separating out those low demand activities from things that are completely restful. So there they might be listening to quiet music, using relaxation. Possibly for people in the group who are meditators, they might talk about meditation as more of a restful activity. So this is an individual activity analysis. It's down to each individual to try and judge for each activity what sort of demands does it place on them. And this is key to develop an understanding of how the current situation is compared to how it used to be in the past. So there's an adjustment here that underpins activity analysis. And using these kind of colours, or whatever colours you prefer, you can start to fill in a diary. So here's a simple activity diary. Starts at midnight, goes through to midday, and then midnight of a 24-hour period. And you just use the colouring key and shade in. You could use a slice of time if it's a quarter of an hour block or a 20-minute block or whatever you've done. And after a couple of days, 3 days, 4 days, a pattern can jump out from these diaries that isn't quite so obvious before people keep diaries. So we really encourage people to have a go at these diaries, and you can download one from the web page where you found this talk. There is an app as well which you can look at, which is called the ME app, and it works on a very similar basis. It's a very simple activity analysis, and there are times that people can then look at this and start to get some ideas of what's working, what's maybe not working quite so well, but they can also look at their sleep pattern as well. So I'll show you a completed one of those in a moment. So here's how an activity diary might look. In the first week you can see that this person's got very broken sleep, very varied getting up times. But in the second week their sleep pattern has started to improve. And if you look at the green there, the rest, there's very little rest in those first 4 days. But in the second week it looks like there's more of a plan to fit in some rest as well. So you can use these colour-in diaries very simply to show changes over time. So I think they're worth doing, certainly for a few days, if not longer. But once you've learnt some lessons from them, it's possibly worth putting them aside for a while and then looking at a more of a planning system. But also, if you have coloured one of these in, then you can take a photo of it, email it into one of the team if you want to share it and discuss it with your clinician. So they're very easy to share. You can share it with the family, you can share it with employers if it feels appropriate. So it's quite a nice way of getting across to people about the balance of activities. One final point on this kind of diary. The red here is the kind of activities that this person tends to find demanding. Now, it can be tempting on a bad day to shade in everything as red because it's hard work on a bad day. But what we're asking people to do with these diaries is to step back from this in the moment evaluation of does it feel hard right now, to what would this be like on a middling day? And if on a middling day it tends to be high demand, sticking to the same colour to shade it in, whether it's a better day or a bad day. Otherwise it starts to become a diary of how you're feeling rather than what you're doing. So that separation, I think, is useful just to bear in mind as you complete it. Looking in a bit more detail at specific activities, different ways of thinking about things that people are working on and their own ways of knowing when to stop. Just listening to hundreds of people in the clinic over the years, we've learnt from people that there seem to be 4 main ways of knowing when to stop an activity, and we know these very simply as the stop rules. So this first one, if you like, is almost not knowing when to stop. It's carrying on. Somebody's symptoms are building up on the red line there. You can see as time's going by they're getting more and more symptoms. They want to keep going, but the symptoms reach a point that they have to stop. It's forced on them at that point. And in the groups we run, a lot of people will be familiar with this experience of hitting the wall. There's a kind of wanting to carry on, but this condition's so different from ordinary tiredness you can push through. There's a point when you just can't push and your body stops. But then the recovery after this is often quite prolonged, and it can lead to worse symptoms the next day, the day after as well. So this is a bit like the boom and bust that we've already looked at. Some people after a while will recognise that they're trying to fight it, but it fights back. And they may be looking at a level of symptoms thinking, if I get that level of symptoms and stop, maybe I'll be stopping at a better point. So if I look at the next slide now and look at this approach, this is the second stop rule. It's called listening to my body. And there's a sense if people get increased symptoms that they could stop and have a break, have a rest, do something else, with the hope that the symptoms then calm down sooner without such prolonged recovery, and then maybe they can start an activity again and do a bit more. So this is a bit more of a stop-start pattern, listening to the body. And some people in our groups will be using this approach, and they'll be aware of certain symptoms that help them know their own sort of personal warning signs, if you like, as to when it's a good time to stop. But asking around the groups, probably 50% of people will say they don't get helpful warning signs that tell them when to stop. That actually their warning signs kick in the day later or the day after that. So for those people, listening to their body is not helpful because their body's telling them what they did 2 days ago or how they've slept, rather than whether it's appropriate to stop in the moment. So this is one of the issues with post-exertional malaise. It tells us what has been happening in the days running up to that particular point. The other issue with listening to my body is, certainly if we ask our groups if they were to listen to their bodies, they're there in the clinic room. We have a group room that we run, and if I ask people what would you do if you were to listen to all the symptoms that you have right now, the collective response is I'd go to bed. So this is a challenge for people that actually listening to their body completely. Sometimes the answer is I'd go to bed, and for some of them that would be not compatible with trying to self-manage and keep the show on the road, really. So this is challenging. It's an approach that's helpful for some, not for others. And I think from the point of view of this talk, it's just reaching an awareness that it exists. It's an approach. For some people it might be helpful, for others it might be unhelpful, or just not even a feasible way of knowing when to stop. There are two other ways of knowing when to stop that we've come across. The third one is using time as a guide. In here somebody will work out their own time period. So they might go for a walk for 5 minutes, for example, and then stop for 10 minutes and then walk home again, because they've worked out that 5 minutes walking is generally manageable. So these are personal guides that people will use, and obviously these might be different on a really bad day, but for middling days they'll build up a knowledge of what's normally manageable. So that's the third guide, using time. The fourth stop rule is using an amount of activity or a quota. So the example here is maybe to read a page and rest, and read a page and rest, rather than keep reading until actually somebody has to stop because it's no longer possible to take in any more information. So this is about building up knowledge again, which is a key part of self-management. Understanding what's manageable, understanding what's normally okay. Another way of looking at this is to use a confidence scale to set a baseline, and a baseline is a sustainable amount of activity that could be done, all things being equal, day after day. So here there's somebody's confidence runs from 0 to 10. It's a very simple scale, and they've just been honest with themselves and thought about how confident they'd be if they went for a 10-minute walk, that they could do that and be moderately functional the next day. And it turns out they weren't very confident of doing that. But by reducing it by half to a 5-minute walk, they've reflected on that, and quite quickly they could see their confidence levels higher with a 5-minute walk. So this is a really simple self-management tool, using a confidence scale to set a baseline. And it's quite helpful if people haven't done something for a while, because they could just reflect for a moment using a confidence scale to get some idea of what their baseline might be. Another way to set a baseline is to keep a diary. So here's a simple example, Joe's walking diary. On day 1, Joe walks for 10 minutes. On day 2, no minutes. On day 3, no minutes. So just looking at that, it's probable that Joe did too much on day 1, we assume. But either way, we'd work out a total of 10 minutes over 3 days, and then just work out a simple average. It's about 3 minutes will do, round it down, keep it easy. And then the idea with this kind of working out a baseline is to set a baseline that's below average. Now Joe has done 10 minutes and has not been able to sustain it. So our advice in this situation would be to set a baseline that's 50% of the average, which might be quite challenging on Joe's day 4 to think about going out for a walk for a minute and a half. Joe might not think that's anywhere near enough. But the key here is that all that Joe's learned so far is that 10 minutes is probably too much walking. They haven't actually learned what is a manageable amount of walking. So the hope is if they stick to their baseline on day 4, maybe repeat it on day 5, on day 6, after a few days of managing a sustainable level, they'll be getting a picture of what might be manageable. And it may be then that they could start to think about building up, but certainly they've got that knowledge then of what is a manageable amount, rather than just learning what is too much. So comparing Joe's experience with Mary, Mary's possibly been a bit more cautious, but she's managed a 3-minute walk on day 1, 3-minute walk on day 2, did a 4-minute walk on day 3. So actually the total's the same for Joe and Mary, but the experience has been very different. The average has been the same, but Mary reflects on what she's been doing, thinks about the confidence scale, and actually she feels confident that she's going to manage a 3-minute walk on day 4, so that's what she decides to do. So using these kind of ways of keeping a record, just reflecting on what people have managed, helps people to zoom in on some of the detail in the day, the specific activities that they may be aware that they could end up overdoing. Whilst at the same time that colour-in diary that we looked at before is like zooming out at the day, zooming out at the week, a kind of helicopter view of the whole pattern of activity, and both of these approaches can be quite helpful. So we've looked at activity analysis, we've looked at pacing, baseline setting, with a view to finding ways of managing post-exertional malaise, which is one of the challenges of living with ME, chronic fatigue syndrome. We now encourage you, when you're ready, to have a look at the session 2 slides, and they'll be focusing more on sleep and elements around sleep management and stress management. Thank you for your attention.